What? He said it for the third time in 2 days. Big shoulders, loud voice, the kind of man who had never once been made to answer for anything. He reached out to shove her. His hand never got there. 4 seconds. That was all it took. She caught his wrist, turned once, and put a 200-pound man down on one knee on a public sidewalk, his arm pinned behind him, his face inches from the pavement. She didn't raise her voice. She never did. "I've held you 3 seconds," she said. "I could hold you a lot longer. I don't want to. I just want you to remember that being big isn't the same thing as being strong." For 18 months, that town had called her the quiet girl from the bakery, timid, maybe a little broken. They had no idea what she used to be.
The bus doors hissed open at 7:12 in the morning, same time as always. Wren Hale stepped up onto the first stair. She held the rail with 2 fingers, not her whole hand. Old habit. Never trust a grip you can't release in half a second. She found a seat near the back, left side, facing the aisle, not because she liked the view. From there, she could see every door on the bus and every person who got on after her. Nobody on that bus knew what that meant. To them, she was just the quiet girl from the bakery. 28 years old, blonde hair pulled back tight, a canvas jacket a little too big for her frame. She said thank you to the driver every single morning and not much else. Small-town people notice small things. And in Cedar Hollow, everyone had already decided who Wren Hale was. Quiet, timid, maybe a little broken. They were wrong. But she never corrected them, not once, not even when it would have cost her almost nothing to. Cedar Hollow was the kind of town most people drove through without remembering the name of. One main street, a hardware store, a diner that had changed owners 4 times in 30 years but never changed its menu, a courthouse square with a war memorial nobody quite remembered the dedication date of anymore. Population just under 6,000. Most of them born within 20 miles of where they'd eventually be buried. It was the kind of town that measured its seasons by which crops were coming in and which football team was playing Friday night, and it had never, not once in its long, unremarkable history, produced a headline anyone outside the county would ever read. That was more than anything why Wren had chosen it. She had come to Cedar Hollow a year and a half ago in the middle of winter with 2 duffel bags and a grandmother who needed somebody closer than a 5-hour drive. Nobody in town asked too many questions about where she'd been before. People here didn't pry. Not really. They watched patiently, the way you watch weather roll in over the hills, waiting to see what it might turn into. What they saw was a young woman who kept to herself, who worked hard and left early, who never once raised her voice, not at a rude customer, not at a driver who pulled away from the curb too fast, not even the one time a loose dog came barreling down Main Street and cut straight through a crowd of pedestrians outside the pharmacy. She'd stepped calmly between the dog and the crowd, and it had trotted off a minute later like it had simply changed its mind. People talked about that for a week. Then they forgot the way people do and went back to seeing what they expected to see. Quiet, timid, maybe a little broken. She let them believe it. It was easier. Easier than explaining a version of her life that most people in Cedar Hollow would never have a frame for anyway. The bus rolled 2 blocks before Grant Colton got on. He came up the steps like he owned the engine underneath them. 2 friends behind him, Chase and Dylan, already laughing at something that wasn't funny yet, waiting to see if it would be. Grant was 30. Big shoulders, the kind built in a gym mirror. He wore a jacket with his old high school number stitched on the sleeve a decade after he'd stopped needing it to mean anything. He'd been back then the kind of boy this town liked to build a whole Friday night around, and some part of him had never quite accepted that the cheering had stopped. His eyes moved down the aisle and landed on Wren. They always did. "Well, look who it is," he said, loud enough for the whole bus to hear. "Quiet girl, still riding the bus like it's the last one out of town." A few people looked up, most looked away faster. Wren didn't move. She kept her eyes on her hands, folded in her lap. Grant dropped into the seat across from her, turning sideways so his knees almost touched hers. Chase and Dylan crowded the row behind him, phones already halfway out of their pockets. "You work at that bakery, right?" Grant said. "The one that smells like a funeral home?" Somebody near the front laughed, quick and nervous, then stopped. Wren said nothing. That's rude, by the way, Dylan added, grinning, phone already up and recording. Not answering people? My mom always said that's rude. Your mom also says you moving back into her basement was temporary, Chase muttered, and Dylan shoved him, and for a second the whole thing might have drifted somewhere else, might have burned itself out the way small cruelties sometimes do when they get bored of themselves. But Grant wasn't bored yet. He leaned closer, close enough that Wren could smell coffee, and cologne close enough that a dozen instincts she'd spent years sharpening began quietly taking notes. I bet you don't even have friends, he said. I bet you go home to some sad little apartment and just sit there, every night, alone. The words were meant to sting. They didn't, not the way he wanted them to, but something in his tone, the casual cruelty of a man who had never once had to sit alone with anything, made her jaw tighten, just barely, just enough that a careful observer might have noticed. Nobody on that bus was careful enough yet. Hey, he said, snapping his fingers an inch from her face. I'm talking to you. His hand moved to her neck, not violent, not yet, just careless the way a man reaches for something he thinks belongs to him. His fingers caught the thin paracord cord under her collar and pulled. It snapped. A small piece of metal skittered across the floor of the bus, spinning once before it stopped near the front step. Worn dark from years of being touched. Shaped, if you looked closely, like a trident. For half a second, something happened in Wren's body that nobody on that bus understood. Her right hand rose 2 inches off her knee. Her weight shifted barely onto the balls of her feet. Her eyes locked onto Grant's wrist with a precision that had nothing to do with fear. It was there, and then it was gone. She caught herself the way a person catches a glass falling off a counter, fast, silent before it ever hits the floor. Her hand went back to her lap. What was that? Grant said, grinning now, holding the broken cord up like a trophy. You collect junk jewelry. Looks like something out of a cereal box. Give it back, Wren said. 2 words, quiet, even. Grant tilted his head delighted, like a dog that had just heard a new sound. Or what? The bus had gone fully silent now. Even Chase and Dylan had stopped laughing, sensing in some animal way that something in the air had shifted. Wren looked up at him for the first time. Her eyes were calm, not angry, calm in a way that made the calm in the bus feel loud by comparison. I'm not looking for trouble, she said, but I'm not going to run from it either. Give it back. Grant laughed, tossed the cord onto the floor instead, and put his boot on it, twisted it once, slow, watching her face for a flinch. Maybe you should learn some manners, he said. This town doesn't need people like you taking up seats. He got up, walked to the back with his friends already laughing about something else, already forgetting her name. Wren waited until he sat down, then she bent unhurried and picked the cord up off the floor. The little trident charm was scratched now, one edge dented from the sole of his boot. She closed her hand around it and said nothing at all. Up front, the driver's knuckles had gone white on the wheel. Earl Higgins was 64 years old, built like a man who used to lift things for a living and hadn't stopped missing it. He'd watched the whole thing in the mirror above his head, the long rectangular one that showed every row. He pulled the bus to the curb at the next stop and set the brake harder than he needed to. Hey, he called back, standing halfway out of his seat. Colton, watch your hands on my bus or I radio it in. Grant didn't even turn around. Go ahead, old man. My dad's on the council that decides your route funding. Careful whose bus you want to keep. Earl's jaw worked side to side. He looked in the mirror at Wren. She caught his eye and gave the smallest shake of her head. Don't. He didn't understand it, not fully, but something in the way she held herself steady, unbothered, made him trust it anyway. He sat back down, pulled the bus back onto the road. Sorry, he muttered mostly to himself. Sorry you have to put up with that every morning. You don't need to apologize for him, Wren said quietly from 3 rows back. You're not the one who did it. Earl glanced in the mirror again. There was something in the way she said that, something that sounded like it came from further away than a bus route in Cedar Hollow. He didn't ask. Not yet. Wren got off 2 stops later in front of Miller's Bakery, a squat brick building with flour dust permanently ground into the window frames. She stood on the sidewalk a moment before going in, closed her hand around the little trident charm one more time. 4 years ago, a man named Danny Ruiz had given her that piece of metal off his own gear, half joking, in the back of a transport plane, somewhere over water neither of them were allowed to name out loud. "For luck," he'd said. "Not that you need it. You're the only one of us who never misses." His teammates had called him Doc. He'd trained as a corpsman before he became something else entirely, the kind of something else that didn't have a name you could put on a business card. He didn't come home. Wren had come home instead. And for the last year and a half, she'd been trying to learn how to be a person who worked in a bakery and rode a bus and let a boy like Grant Colton put his boot on a dead friend's memory without doing what every cell in her body had trained her to do about it. She pushed open the door. The bell rang. "Morning, Wren," said Marjorie Miller from behind the counter, flour on her forearms up to the elbow. "You're pale. You all right?" "I'm fine," Wren said, and reached for her apron. "Just a long ride." Marjorie studied her a second longer than she needed to, the way people in small towns do when they suspect there's a whole ocean under a very calm surface. Then she let it go, because that was the deal in Cedar Hollow. You didn't push, you noticed and waited and hoped somebody eventually told you the truth on their own. The morning passed the way mornings did. Bread came out of the oven at 8, coffee brewed at 8:15. By 9, the retirees were in the same 6 or 7 faces every day, trading gossip over cinnamon rolls and black coffee. Wren liked the mornings at the bakery. Liked the heat of the ovens, the rhythm of it, scoop, weigh, fold, bake. It asked nothing of her except her hands and her attention. No decisions that mattered, no lives on the line. For a year and a half, that had felt like enough. Some days, it still did. Other days, like today, with a dented trident charm sitting heavy in her jacket pocket, it felt more like hiding than living. Around 9:30, a woman named Ruth Anders came in for her usual order, and while Wren rang her up, Ruth leaned on the counter and lowered her voice. "I heard about this morning," she said, "on the bus." Wren kept wiping down the espresso machine. "News travels fast." "It's a small town, honey. News doesn't travel. It just hangs in the air and everybody breathes it in eventually." Ruth shook her head. "That Colton boy. His mother would be ashamed, God rest her. She was a kind woman. I don't know what happened between her passing and now, but that boy's turned into something she never would have recognized." "People change," Wren said noncommittally, sliding a paper bag with a cinnamon roll across the counter. "Some people change because life humbles them," Ruth said. "Other people just get worse the longer nobody stops them. I worry it's the second kind with him." She paid, tucked her change into a worn coin purse, and buttoned her coat back up against the morning chill. "You take care of yourself, Wren. This town's better for having you in it, whether folks say so out loud or not." Wren watched her go, the bell over the door ringing once behind her, and felt something loosen slightly in her chest. It wasn't much. A kind word from an old woman on her way to somewhere else. But she'd learned in the last year and a half to let small kindnesses count for exactly as much as they were worth, instead of dismissing them the way she used to, back when the only currency she trusted was competence under pressure. Kindness was its own kind of competence, she was starting to understand. It just didn't come with a rank or a ribbon attached. At 11, an older man in a faded army cap came in for his usual black coffee, no sugar, and a corner piece of the cornbread, if there was any left. "Morning, Frank," Wren said, sliding the coffee across the counter before he even asked. Frank Delaney was 71 years old, with a cane he leaned on more for company than for need, and eyes that had spent decades reading people before they spoke a word. He noticed the small scrape on her jacket collar, the place where the cord had rubbed against her skin when it snapped. "You all right, kid?" he asked. "I'm fine, Frank." "You say that like it's the answer to every question anybody could ever ask you." Wren almost smiled. Almost. "Maybe it is. Frank took his coffee to his usual table by the window, the one that looked out onto Main Street, and settled in with the newspaper he never actually read anymore, just held out of habit, like some men hold a hat they no longer wear outside. He watched Wren work for a minute. The way she moved, economical, no wasted motion, every step placed exactly where it needed to be, no more, no less. He'd seen that kind of movement before, a long time ago in a different life, watching young men load gear onto trucks before sunrise. He didn't say anything, not yet, but he filed it away the way old soldiers file away everything quietly for later. Around noon, Wren carried a crate of empty flour sacks out back, and her canvas backpack came off the hook by the door and swung against the counter. Frank caught the motion out of the corner of his eye and, without quite meaning to, looked twice. There on the front flap was a rectangle of fabric slightly darker than the canvas around it. A patch had been there once, stitched down along all four edges, then removed carefully, the way a person removes something they don't want asked about but can't bring themselves to cut away entirely. The stitching holes were still visible if you knew to look for them. 4 small rows, evenly spaced, the kind of tight, uniform stitching that wasn't done by a hobby seamstress. Frank had seen that kind of removed patch before. On old friends, on himself once, a lifetime ago, on a jacket he still owned and never wore. "That yours?" he asked, nodding toward the backpack as Wren came back through with the empty crate. "Backpack's mine, yeah. No, I mean," he gestured with 2 fingers at the flap, "the patch that used to be there." Something crossed Wren's face there, and gone so fast most people would have missed it entirely. Frank didn't miss it. Old men who read faces for a living, even if that living ended decades ago, don't lose the habit. "Old gear," she said. "Doesn't mean much." "Didn't say it meant anything," Frank said easily, holding up both hands, the picture of an old man minding his own business. "Just an observation. I used to sew mine on myself. Terrible at it, crooked as a country road." Wren allowed herself a small smile at that. The first real one he'd gotten out of her in weeks. "I bet you were." 22 years in supply and logistics, Frank said. "Never fired a shot at anybody in anger my whole career. But I moved enough gear through enough hands to recognize good stitching when I see the ghost of it." He sipped his coffee, watching her over the rim of the cup, not pushing, just present. "Whatever you were, kid, whoever you were, this town's lucky to have you pouring its coffee." Wren didn't answer that directly. She only nodded once, picked up a rag, and went back to wiping down the counter, and Frank let the silence settle between them, the way you let a held breath finally out, slow and unhurried, satisfied with what little truth had surfaced, and wise enough not to go fishing for more. Around 1, an older woman named Louise Parker came in for her usual a plain scone and a small black tea, the way she had almost every weekday for the 2 years since she'd retired from teaching 6th grade math at the county school. "Long face today," Louise observed, setting her coin purse on the counter. "That Colton boy again." Wren blinked, surprised. "How did you know?" "Honey, I taught mathematics in this county for 36 years. I know when a number doesn't add up, and I know when a young woman's carrying something heavier than she's letting on." Louise counted out her change with the careful precision of someone who had graded a great many homework assignments in her life. "That boy was in my classroom once, you know. 11 years old. Sharp enough when he wanted to be, but even then he had a habit of finding the smallest kid in the room and figuring out exactly which words would make them cry the fastest. Doesn't surprise me. Nothing about people like that ever really does," Louise said. "The sad part is, nobody ever made him stop. Not his teachers, not his father. He learned real early that there wasn't a consequence in this town big enough to reach him." She took her tea and her scone and paused at the door. "Somebody ought to teach him different one of these days, preferably somebody with the patience for it." She left before Wren could answer the bell over the door ringing once behind her, and Wren stood a long moment with the last of the morning light slanting gold across the counter, thinking about numbers that didn't add up and about a lesson that had been 20 years overdue. The bakery closed at 2 on weekdays. Wren finished wiping down the counters, hung her apron, and checked the clock on the wall. 2:15. The bus to Riverside Care Home left Main Street at 2:30. If she missed it, the next one wasn't for 90 minutes, and she didn't like to be late. Not on a day her grandmother was expecting her. She walked the 4 blocks quickly, hands in her jacket pockets, one fist curled loosely around the trident charm. The bus was already at the stop when she arrived, doors open, Earl behind the wheel again for the afternoon route. "Afternoon, Wren," he said, and there was something gentler in his voice than there had been that morning, like a man trying in a small, clumsy way to make up for something he hadn't been able to prevent. "Afternoon, Earl." She took a seat near the middle this time, fewer people on the afternoon route. No sign of Grant or his friends, thankfully. Just a handful of regulars tired after work and an elderly woman 2 rows up, knitting something long and blue. 2 rows ahead of her, a young woman named Nora Fenwick sat with one hand resting on the round curve of her stomach, 7 months along, a paperback baby name book open in her lap, even though she and her husband had already picked a name months ago. Nora rode this route 3 times a week in for checkups at the clinic near the care home, and she and Wren had built the kind of small, easy friendship that happens between 2 quiet people who ride the same bus often enough. "How's Eleanor doing?" Nora asked, twisting around in her seat. "Nervous," Wren said. "Won't admit it, but she is." "Friday, right? The surgery?" "Friday." Wren managed a small smile. "How's the little one doing in there?" "Kicking like she's already got somewhere to be." Nora laughed, soft and warm, and rubbed a slow circle over her stomach. "David wants to name her after his grandmother. I keep telling him Mildred is not making a comeback no matter how much he loves that woman." "I don't know," Wren said. "Mildred's got a certain something." "You're no help at all," Nora said, grinning, and turned back around as the bus rolled on, and for a few minutes the world outside the window was just ordinary. Telephone poles, a dog on a porch, a man mowing his lawn in the last light of the afternoon. It was, Wren would think much later, one of the last ordinary afternoons any of them would have for a while. And then, just past the edge of town, the bus passed a building Wren had seen 100 times before but never really looked at. A squat, 2-story structure, brick gone gray with weather, windows boarded on the 2nd floor. A faded sign still hung above the door, the paint peeling but the letters just barely legible. Colton Properties, leasing office, established 1988. Wren's eyes lingered on it a moment longer than they needed to. She didn't know why. There was no reason a leasing office should mean anything to her. Colton was a common enough name in a town this size, and half the buildings on Main Street probably had some connection to it, the way half the buildings in any small town belonged eventually to whoever had the most money and the least patience for anyone poorer than them. But something about the sign caught in her chest like a splinter she couldn't quite locate. For just a moment, the bus window seemed to fall away and she was somewhere else entirely. A cargo hold, dim red light, the smell of jet fuel and salt air. Danny Ruiz, 26 years old, cross-legged on the floor with his gear half-packed around him, telling her for the 3rd time that week about an apartment his family had lost back home when he was a kid. Some landlord, some letter, some cardboard boxes on a curb in the rain. He never said it like it was a sad story. He said it like it was the reason he'd signed up in the first place. The thing that had put a floor under him when the rest of his life had none. "Everybody's got a reason," he'd said, grinning that easy grin of his. "That's mine. Somebody took the ground out from under my family once. I decided I'd rather be the ground for somebody else." Wren blinked, and the memory folded itself back down into whatever quiet place she kept it, and the bus window was just a bus window again, the leasing office sliding past and out of view behind a stand of bare trees. She didn't know why Danny's voice had surfaced right then, right there, looking at a faded real estate sign in a town he'd never even heard of. She told herself it was nothing. Grief plays tricks like that sometimes, surfacing in places it has no business being, the way an old song can ambush you in a grocery store, or the smell of a particular soap can put you right back in a room you thought you'd left for good. She let it go. Filed it away the same way Frank had filed away the way she moved. For later. when there was time to think about things that weren't survival or schedules or her grandmother's surgery 6 days away. The bus rolled on. Riverside Care Home sat on a bend in the river the town was named for, a low brick building surrounded by pine trees, and a garden the residents took turns tending in the summer. In late autumn, the garden had gone quiet, the beds cut back and covered against the coming frost. But somebody had left a string of small solar lights along the front walk, and they blinked on one by one as the afternoon light faded. Wren signed in at the front desk, the same signature every time, and walked down the hallway to room 114, past the small nursing station where 2 aides in blue scrubs were laughing quietly over something on a phone screen, past a bulletin board covered in construction paper leaves that some volunteer group had made for the season, past the particular hush of a place built for people who had already lived most of their lives and were simply patiently going on living the rest of them. Eleanor Hale was sitting up in bed when Wren came in, reading glasses pushed up into her white hair, a paperback mystery novel open in her lap. 83 years old and still sharper than most people half her age. "There's my girl," Eleanor said, setting the book aside. "You look tired." "I'm fine, Grandma." Eleanor gave her a long look. The exact same look Marjorie had given her that morning, the exact same look Frank had given her over his coffee. Small towns. Everyone watching everyone, gentle about it, nobody pushing too hard. "You keep saying that word," Eleanor said. "Fine. I spent 41 years as a nurse. I know what fine sounds like when it's true, and I know what it sounds like when it's a door somebody's holding shut." Wren sat in the chair beside the bed and took her grandmother's hand, thin now, the skin soft as paper, but the grip still surprisingly strong. "There's a boy," Wren admitted quietly, "on the bus. He gives me trouble sometimes." "What kind of trouble?" "Nothing I can't handle." "That's not what I asked." Wren almost laughed. 83 years old and she still didn't miss a thing. "He likes an audience, likes making people feel small in front of other people. This morning he broke Danny's necklace off my neck and put his boot on it." Eleanor's expression didn't change much, but her grip on Wren's hand tightened just slightly. "The trident piece, it's fine. I fixed the cord." "That's not what I asked either." Eleanor's voice was gentle, but it carried the particular steadiness Wren remembered from childhood, the voice her grandmother used when she wanted a real answer instead of a comfortable one. "How did it feel, watching him do that?" Wren was quiet a long moment. "Like every part of me wanted to move," she admitted finally. "And I didn't." "Why not?" "Because moving the way I wanted to move would have ended his jaw, Grandma. Not his pride, his jaw." She said it plainly, without drama, the way a person states a fact of physics. "There's no undoing something like that, and I don't want to be the kind of person who breaks the things she's supposed to be protecting people from." "That's a wise line to walk," Eleanor said. "I raised your mother, and I helped raise you in a family that has never once run from a fight worth having. But I also taught you when you were 7 years old and some boy pulled your hair on the playground that there's a difference between courage and cruelty." "Do you remember what I told you? You don't need to win," Wren said softly. "You need to hold on to who you are." "That's right." Eleanor squeezed her hand. "Whoever this boy is, he's going to keep pushing until he finds the bottom of you. Everyone like that does. They can't help it. It's the only way they know how to measure themselves against how far they can push someone quieter than they are." "I know his type," Wren said. "I served with men who thought volume was the same thing as strength. Most of them washed out in the first 2 weeks. And the ones who didn't wash out, learned eventually that real strength doesn't need anybody watching to know it's true." Wren looked down at their joined hands. "I'm just tired of being underestimated, Grandma. Some days it's almost funny, other days it isn't." "Let it be funny more than it isn't," Eleanor said with the ghost of a smile. "Bitterness is heavy, sweetheart. I carried some once, a long time ago after your grandfather passed, and it near about broke my back before I finally set it down. Don't pick it up on my account, or Danny's, or anybody's. I'll try. Trying's all any of us can promise." Eleanor patted her hand and reached back for her book. "Now go home. You look like you haven't slept right in a week, and don't argue with a woman who spent 4 decades reading exhaustion off a person's face for a living, long before you ever needed her to. Wren stood, leaned down, and kissed her grandmother's forehead. I love you, Grandma. I love you too. And Wren. Eleanor caught her wrist gently before she could pull away. Whatever's coming with that boy, I trust you to know the difference between defending yourself and destroying him. You've always known that difference, even when the world made it hard to remember. I raised you to remember it anyway. Wren nodded, throat too tight to answer, and stepped out into the hallway. She walked the last 2 blocks home instead of waiting for the bus, needing the cold evening air on her face. Cedar Hollow at dusk had a particular kind of quiet. Porch lights coming on one by one, the smell of somebody's dinner drifting out an open window, a dog barking twice at nothing and then going silent. Her apartment was small, above a hardware store on 3rd Street, 1 bedroom, a kitchen the size of a closet, and a window that looked out over the rooftops toward the river. She stopped in the little kitchen first, filled a glass of water she didn't drink, and stood a moment at the window, looking down at the street. A man was closing up the hardware store below, pulling the metal grate down over the front window, the way he did every night at exactly this hour. A car passed. Somewhere a screen door slapped shut. Ordinary sounds. Ordinary town. She used to find that unbearable in the first few months after she came home. The ordinariness of it. The way life just kept going, ringing up flour and yeast and paper bags, while somewhere else men she'd trained beside were still doing the work she used to do, still carrying the weight she had set down. She didn't find it unbearable anymore. Most days she found it something closer to a gift. A town that didn't need saving. Not really. Not the way the places she used to go needed saving. A town where the biggest danger most days was a loose dog near the pharmacy or a slick patch of ice on Main Street in January. She'd told herself, walking off that base a year and a half ago, that this was what she wanted. Ordinary. Quiet. A life-sized right instead of a life-sized for war. She still believed that. Mostly. She sat on the edge of her bed and took the broken cord out of her jacket pocket. The trident charm caught the last of the evening light through the window. Small, scratched, now dented at one edge, still unmistakably itself. She turned it over once in her palm the way she had 100 times before, tracing the 3 worn prongs with her thumb, the way another person might turn over a coin for luck. It had never brought either of them luck, not really, not in the way Danny had meant it. But it had brought her something else in the months since. A reminder. A small, stubborn insistence that some things once given were never fully lost, no matter how far a person carried them, or how long. She thought about the bus that morning. About Grant's boot coming down on it, carelessly entitled, the way a man steps on something without ever once wondering what it might mean to somebody else. She thought about Danny, and the plane, and the mission neither of them had known would be his last. And she thought about her grandmother's voice, worn smooth by 4 decades of watching people carry weight that was never theirs to carry alone. You don't need to win. You need to hold on to who you are. She had chosen a year and a half ago to try to hold on to exactly that, to let the anger sink down into something quieter, to find a town small enough and slow enough that nobody would ever ask her to be anything else again. But holding on to who you are, she thought, tying a new cord onto the little charm with careful, steady hands only means something when there's something worth standing in front of. She hadn't found that yet in Cedar Hollow. Not really. Just a bakery and a bus route and a bully who thought her silence was surrender. She didn't know yet how soon that would change. She didn't know yet what that leasing office sign faded and peeling above a boarded-up window would come to mean to her. She thought, too, about Ruth Anders and the way she'd said this town's better for having you in it so simply, like it cost her nothing to say and meant everything at the same time. Small towns had a way of loving you without ever quite telling you they'd noticed you were there to love. She was still learning how to hear it when they did. She thought about Frank and the way his eyes had passed over the ghost of a patch on her backpack and hadn't pried, only offered her a door she could walk through whenever she was ready, and not 1 second before. She thought about Nora's hand resting on her stomach, about the baby who would be born into a town where, God willing, nothing would ever ask of her what had once been asked of Wren. That was the whole of it, she thought. That was the reason a person did what she'd done once in places she still wasn't allowed to name out loud. Not for glory, not even in the end for country, in the abstract way people always meant that word. For this. For a woman with a knitting bag and a woman with a baby name book and an old man who wore his memories like a hat he no longer put on outside. For ordinary Mondays that got to stay ordinary. Grant Colton would never understand that kind of math. Men like him counted differently. They counted rooms they could dominate, faces that looked away first, whose father knew whose father. They had never once had to count the cost of the alternative because nobody had ever made them. Across town, in a house with a wide front lawn kept green even in the driest part of summer, Grant Colton sat at the kitchen island, scrolling through his phone, half listening to the television in the next room. His father, Walter Colton, came in from his study, still in his work clothes, tie loosened, a glass of scotch in one hand. Walter was 62, silver-haired, the kind of man who'd learned a long time ago that a firm handshake and a council seat could smooth over almost anything. "Heard you had some fun on the bus this morning," Walter said, not quite looking at his son, pouring himself a second glass. "Chase's mother mentioned it at the grocery store. Word travels fast in this town." "It wasn't anything," Grant said, not looking up from his phone. "Just messing around." "That bakery girl." "Yeah, quiet one. Doesn't even fight back." Walter grunted something that might have been amusement, might have been disinterest. It was hard to tell with him anymore. "Just watch yourself. I don't need some video with our name attached to it. Council seat's up for re-election in the spring, and I don't need the Hale girl's face plastered on the local news because you can't help yourself on a Monday morning." "Relax, Dad. Nobody's filming anything." "Somebody's always filming something," Walter said, and there was, for just a moment, something almost like weariness in his voice. The weariness of a man who'd spent 30 years cleaning up small messes so they never became large ones. Then it passed, and he took his scotch and his tie back toward his study, already thinking about something else entirely, already 3 steps removed from whatever his son did on a bus he would never once have to ride himself. Grant watched him go, then went back to his phone, unbothered, already scrolling toward whatever came next. He had no memory later that week of the exact moment his father said those words. He had no memory of most warnings anybody had ever given him. Warnings were, in Grant Colton's experience, things that happened to other people. Consequences were things that happened to other people too. He had never once, in 30 years, been made to learn otherwise. That, more than anything, was about to change. Somewhere out there, quietly unnoticed, the world had already begun keeping a different kind of ledger on him. Down the hall, in a room he never went into anymore, a locked filing cabinet sat against the wall of Walter Colton's study. The same cabinet that had sat there for over 20 years, full of leases and notices and old paperwork nobody in the family had thought about in a very long time. Somewhere in one of those folders, yellowed at the edges, was a name neither Colton man had spoken out loud in decades. It meant nothing to them. It hadn't meant anything to them in 20 years. It was about to mean everything. But that Monday night, the study door stayed closed, the filing cabinet stayed locked, and the only sound in that big, quiet house was the television murmuring in the next room and the soft, careless scroll of a young man's thumb across a phone screen, already forgetting, already moving on, the way he always had. Wren closed her eyes that night and let the thought go the way she'd been taught to let go of everything that wasn't useful before sleep. Tomorrow was Tuesday. There would be bread to bake and a bus to ride and a grandmother getting one day closer to Friday. She had no way of knowing, drifting off in the dark above a hardware store on 3rd Street, that Tuesday would be the day everything in Cedar Hollow started quietly and then all at once to come undone. That night she dreamed, the way she sometimes did, of the transport plane and Danny's laugh, and a trident-shaped piece of metal spinning through the air toward her open hand. In the dream, she caught it every time. In the dream, nobody's boot ever touched the ground where it landed. She woke before dawn, the way she always did, and lay still in the dark for a long moment, listening to the hum of the town that had no idea what it was about to find out. Somewhere across that same town, Grant Colton was sleeping soundly, dreaming of nothing at all. Certain, in the easy way of men who have never once been made to answer for anything, that Monday had been just another Monday. He had no idea that a silence like Wren Hale's does not come from weakness. It comes from choice. And choices, sooner or later in every story like this one, come due. The 7:12 bus would run again in the morning, exactly on schedule the way it always had. And so whether the town of Cedar Hollow was ready for it or not, would everything that had been waiting patiently underneath it. Tuesday morning came in gray and quiet, the kind of gray that made Cedar Hollow look like a photograph of itself. Wren woke before her alarm the way she always did and lay still a moment listening to the pipes tick in the wall. 6:15. Bread wouldn't wait for anybody's mood, so she got up, showered, dressed, and tied the paracord cord back around her neck, the little trident charm settling against her collarbone the way it had for a year and a half now. She looked at it once in the mirror before she left. Scratched, dented at one edge, still hers. She didn't know yet that today would be the day it stopped being just a memory and started being evidence. The bakery smelled like cinnamon and yeast by 7, and Marjorie was already elbow-deep in dough when Wren came through the back door. "You're early," Marjorie said, not looking up. "Couldn't sleep." "That boy again?" Wren tied her apron without answering, which was its own kind of answer, and Marjorie let it be. They worked in comfortable silence for a while, the ovens ticking as they warmed, the radio low in the corner playing something from decades before either of them was born. At 8:15, Frank came in for his coffee cap pulled low against the wind outside. "Storm's coming this weekend," he said, settling at his table. "Nee's been telling me since Sunday. Never wrong." "Better be wrong about Friday," Wren said, sliding his coffee across. "Grandma's got a surgery. Don't need bad weather stacked on top of it." "Friday'll be fine," Frank said, with more certainty than his knee probably deserved. "Old bones lie about a lot of things. I've learned not to trust every ache." He watched her for a second the way he'd started doing since yesterday, not suspicious, just curious, in a patient, unhurried way. "You riding the 7:12 again this morning?" "I already did. Came in on it." "Why?" "No reason." He sipped his coffee. "Just wondering if that Colton boy's found something better to do with his mornings." Wren's mouth pulled into something that wasn't quite a smile. "I doubt it." She had no idea, wiping down the counter a few minutes later, just how right she was. 2 blocks away, Grant Colton woke up in a mood he couldn't fully explain to himself. He told himself it was nothing. Told himself Monday had gone fine, that watching the quiet girl swallow another round of humiliation without a word had felt exactly as satisfying as it always did. But some small, unexamined part of him had noticed something Monday morning that he didn't like thinking about. A flicker. Half a second where her hand had come up off her knee, fast, sharp, controlled, and then folded itself back down like nothing had happened at all. He didn't have a name for what he'd seen. He only knew it had bothered him the way an unlocked door bothers a man who likes believing every door in his life stays shut unless he opens it himself. So on Tuesday morning, without quite deciding to, Grant decided to push harder, not because Monday hadn't worked, because some small animal part of him wanted to see that flicker again, wanted to know if he could make it happen on command. He gathered Chase and Dylan outside their usual corner, and the 3 of them walked to the stop a block early, the way boys walk when they've already decided the morning is going to belong to them. The 8:40 bus was fuller than usual. A dozen regulars, briefcases, and lunch bags, the low murmur of a town heading into its day. Nora Fenwick sat near the front this time, 2 rows behind the driver, one hand resting on her stomach, as always, a bag from the pharmacy in her lap. She'd had a checkup that morning. Everything fine. She was humming something under her breath, some tune only she could hear. Frank sat further back, cane hooked over the seat in front of him, newspaper folded but unread on his knee. Wren wasn't on this bus. She'd already left for the bakery an hour earlier. It was Nora and Frank riding it now. Ordinary people on an ordinary Tuesday, with no idea that the morning was about to ask something of them neither one had signed up for. Grant and his friends got on 3 stops in loud, already laughing, already scanning the aisle out of pure habit for someone smaller than themselves to aim the morning at. They found Frank first. "Hey, old-timer," Grant said, dropping into the seat across the aisle, kicking one boot up onto the cane hooked in front of Frank's row. "This thing yours?"
"Looks like it's seen better decades." "It's mine," Frank said evenly. "And I'd appreciate you keeping your boot off it." "Or what?" Grant said, grinning at Chase and Dylan, the same grin he'd used on Wren the day before. The grin of a man who had never once had that question answered in a way he didn't like. "Or nothing," Frank said. "I'm 71 years old, son. I've got nothing left to prove to you. Just keep your boot off my cane."
Something about the calm in Frank's voice needled Grant worse than fear would have. He nudged the cane, slow, deliberate, until it slid off the seat back and clattered to the floor of the bus. A few passengers looked over. Nobody moved. Frank bent to pick it up, and as he did, his knee, the one that had been complaining since Sunday, buckled slightly under him, and he had to grab the seat rail to keep from going down entirely. Grant laughed a short bark of a sound, and Dylan laughed with him, and for one terrible second the whole bus felt like it was holding its breath, waiting to see if that was going to be the worst of it. It wasn't. Nora had turned around at the sound, at the small commotion of an old man nearly falling, and without thinking, without any plan beyond simple decency, she got up. "Hey," she said, moving back a row, steadying Frank's elbow with one hand. "Are you okay?" "I'm fine, dear," Frank said, embarrassed more than hurt, straightening up with his cane back in hand. "Just an old knee having its say." "You should be more careful," Nora said, turning to Grant, now 7 months pregnant, and apparently unbothered by the size difference between them, the particular fearlessness some people find only when someone smaller than them is being hurt. "He's 71 years old. What is wrong with you?" Grant's grin faltered for half a second, caught off guard by the fact that someone had actually spoken up. Then it came back, uglier this time. "Nobody asked the pregnant lady for her opinion," he said. "I'm giving it anyway," Nora said, voice steady despite the color rising in her cheeks. "Leave him alone." "Or what?" Grant said again, and this time he stood, closing the distance, close enough that Nora instinctively put a hand up, not to strike him, just to create space, a small defensive motion any mother would make without thinking. Grant caught her wrist. It wasn't hard, it wasn't by itself enough to leave a mark, but it was enough in a moving bus with a woman 7 months pregnant already off balance from standing to send a jolt of real fear through the whole vehicle. Nora stumbled back a step, one hand flying to her stomach, the other still caught in Grant's grip, and for one heartbeat, one terrible, swaying heartbeat as the bus took a turn, it looked like she might go down entirely. "Grant," Chase said, suddenly nervous, suddenly aware that something had shifted from cruel joke into something with a shape he didn't like. "Man, let her go. She's pregnant." Grant let go, more startled by his own hand than anything else, and Nora caught the seat back, breathing hard, safe but shaken in a way that had nothing to do with drama and everything to do with how close a small, careless thing had come to being much worse. The bus driver, a substitute filling in for Earl's day off, had no idea what to do. He pulled to the curb, hands shaking slightly on the wheel, and called toward the back. "Everybody all right?" "We're fine," Frank said, though his voice wasn't quite steady either, standing now with one arm around Nora's shoulders, glaring at Grant with the particular fury of an old man who has seen enough of the world to know exactly how close that had come to being a tragedy instead of a scare. Grant, for his part, looked almost surprised by his own hands. He hadn't meant, he would say later, for it to go that far. He never meant for anything to go that far. That had always somehow been enough of an excuse before. It wasn't going to be enough today. Wren heard about it 40 minutes later, standing behind the counter at the bakery when Earl himself came through the door, still in his day-off clothes, face tight with worry.
"Wren," he said before the bell over the door had even finished ringing, "you need to hear this from me before you hear it from somebody else."
She set down the tray she was holding. Something in his face told her whatever came next mattered.
"Nora and Frank," Earl said, "this morning, on the bus. Colton boy shoved past Frank, knocked his cane, and then grabbed Nora's wrist when she stepped in to stop him. She almost went down. She's all right, the baby's fine. They checked her at the clinic just to be sure. But Wren..."
He stopped, hands opening and closing at his sides, an old man with no outlet for the anger sitting in his chest.
"It could have gone a lot worse."
Wren stood very still. Something in her, something that had been kept quiet on purpose for a year and a half, something she had built entire routines and bakery shifts and bus rides around keeping still, shifted. Not rage. Something steadier than rage. The old discipline surfacing clear-eyed, already 3 steps ahead of her feelings. Because something had changed in the equation. This wasn't about her anymore. This wasn't a boy putting his boot on her own memory of a friend she'd lost. This was an old man nearly knocked down and a pregnant woman nearly hurt on a bus that ran the same route at the same time every single day. If it had happened once, it would happen again.
"Where are they now?"
she asked, already untying her apron.
"Nora's at the clinic. They're keeping her for observation just to be safe. Frank went home, said his knee needed rest."
Earl hesitated.
"Wren, I don't know what you're thinking, but that boy's still out there riding around with his friends like nothing happened. Cocky as ever. I saw him 20 minutes ago outside the pharmacy."
Wren looked at Marjorie, who had come out from the back at the sound of Earl's voice, flour still on her hands, listening with growing alarm.
"Go," Marjorie said simply. "I've got the shop."
Wren found them outside the pharmacy, exactly where Earl said they'd be. Grant, Chase, and Dylan leaning against the brick wall, Grant scrolling through his phone with the easy posture of a man who had already decided the morning's incident wasn't worth thinking about twice. He looked up as she approached, and something in his face brightened, delighted by the novelty of it.
"Well, look who found her voice," he said. "Come to yell at me too?" "You put your hands on a pregnant woman?" Wren said. Her voice was quiet, but it carried the way it always did when she meant every word. "And you nearly knocked a 71-year-old man to the ground."
"She got in my way,"
Grant said, shrugging, already bored.
"Not my fault she's clumsy."
"She stepped in because you were bullying an old man for the 2nd day in a row," Wren said. "This ends now."
Grant laughed, glancing at his friends, delighted, genuinely delighted by the sheer audacity of the quiet bakery girl standing in front of him with her chin up and her voice steady. "Or what?" he said, for the 3rd time in 2 days, the question that had never once in his life come with a real answer attached to it. He stepped closer the way he'd stepped closer to Nora that morning, the same careless entitlement, the same certainty that space belonged to him wherever he chose to occupy it. He reached out, not violently, just to shove her back a step, to reestablish in the only language he knew exactly who controlled the sidewalk. His hand never reached her shoulder. What happened next took 4 seconds. People who were there would argue about it for weeks afterward, exaggerating some parts, underselling others, the way memory does with anything that happens too fast for the mind to properly file it. What actually happened was this. Wren caught his wrist before his hand ever closed the distance, her grip finding the exact point above the joint that took the strength out of a much bigger man's arm without requiring any strength of her own. She turned using his own forward momentum, and in one smooth motion that looked less like violence and more like a dance step gone wrong for only one of the 2 people involved, brought him down onto one knee on the sidewalk. His arm was pinned behind him, angled just enough to hold without breaking anything. His face was inches from the pavement. He couldn't move his shoulder without pain reminding him exactly why he shouldn't try. "Stop," Wren said, and her voice hadn't risen at all. It was, if anything, quieter than before. "You're going to stop, not because I'm making you,
because it's the right thing to do, and you've never once in your life had somebody force you to find that out.
Chase and Dylan stood frozen, phones half raised, not sure whether to record or to run. Grant made a sound, somewhere between a grunt and a curse, straining against a hold that didn't budge no matter how hard he pulled.
"Get off me, you crazy—"
"I've held you 3 seconds," Wren said. "I could hold you a lot longer if I wanted to make a point."
"I don't. I just want you to remember the next time you think about grabbing someone smaller than you that being big isn't the same thing as being strong." She released him. It happened as fast as the hold itself had. One moment his arm was pinned, controlled, immovable. The next he was scrambling up off the sidewalk on his own, red-faced, humiliated in a way he had never once in his adult life experienced, in front of his own friends, on a public street, in the town where his family's name was supposed to mean something. "You're insane," he said, backing away, cradling his shoulder, even though nothing was actually damaged, just startled, just reminded of a vulnerability he'd never had to think about before. "You attacked me. Everybody saw it. You attacked me." "You put your hands on a pregnant woman this morning," Wren said, calm as still water. "I put my hand on your wrist for 4 seconds. If you want to talk about what actually happened today, I'm happy to have that conversation with anybody who asks." Grant didn't answer. He turned and walked away, fast, Chase and Dylan trailing after him, throwing uncertain glances back over their shoulders, already in some dim animal way understanding that something had shifted today that none of them fully had words for yet. Wren stood alone on the sidewalk outside the pharmacy, breathing evenly, hands loose at her sides. The trident charm settling back against her collarbone where it had shifted during the motion. She had not enjoyed it. That was the truth she would have told anyone who asked, though nobody did, not that day. There was no satisfaction in it, only relief, the particular relief of a held breath finally released, of a principle finally allowed to do the one thing it existed for. She had no idea, walking back toward the bakery, that Grant Colton was already on the phone with his father. And she had no idea that by that evening it would be her own name and not his on a police report. Walter Colton's version of the story, by the time it reached Chief Marcus Doyle's desk that afternoon, bore only a passing resemblance to what had happened on that sidewalk. "My son was assaulted," Walter said, standing in the small police station with the particular stiffness of a man used to being listened to the moment he opened his mouth. "In broad daylight. Unprovoked, this woman attacked him, threw him to the ground, twisted his arm. He could have been seriously hurt." Chief Doyle, a broad-shouldered man in his 50s with 26 years on the Cedar Hollow force, leaned back in his chair and studied Walter across the desk. He'd heard a slightly different version already from 2 separate witnesses who'd called in on their own, unprompted, describing an old man's cane knocked to the floor and a pregnant woman grabbed hard enough to nearly fall. "Walter," Doyle said carefully, "I've got 2 other reports crossing my desk about your son this morning. One involves an elderly man on the bus. One involves a pregnant woman." "That's a separate matter," Walter said quickly, waving a hand. "Kids being kids, a little roughhousing, nothing that rises to what happened this afternoon. I want charges filed. Assault. My son has bruising on his shoulder to prove it." Doyle rubbed his jaw. 26 years on this job had taught him to recognize the particular sound of a man trying to control a story before the story could control him. "I'll need to bring her in," he said finally. "Ask her some questions. That's standard given the report. But Walter, I want to be straight with you. If what those other witnesses are describing checks out, this isn't going to look the way you want it to look." "Let me worry about how it looks," Walter said. "I've got a council seat and a re-election coming, Marcus. I'd appreciate you handling this quickly and quietly." Doyle didn't answer that directly. He'd been chief long enough to know exactly what quickly and quietly usually meant coming from a man like Walter Colton, and he didn't much care for it. But a report was a report, and procedure was procedure, and so, an hour later, an officer knocked on the door of Miller's Bakery and asked politely but firmly for Wren Hale to come down to the station. Marjorie stood in the doorway, flour still dusting her apron, watching the patrol car pull away with Wren in the passenger seat. "This is wrong," she said to no one in particular.
This is just wrong. Frank arrived 20 minutes later, cane in hand, having heard the news from Earl, who had heard it from someone at the pharmacy who'd seen the whole thing on the sidewalk.
Nora came too, discharged from the clinic. Baby fine but pale, with the particular fury of a mother who has just watched somebody protect her get punished for it. "We need to give statements," Frank said grimly. "Every single one of us who saw any part of this. That boy's father isn't going to let the truth win on its own. We have to help it along."
"I'll go right now," Nora said, one hand still resting protectively on her stomach. "I'm coming with you," Frank said. Marjorie looked at the closed sign she was about to flip on the bakery door, glanced once at the ovens, still warm behind her, and made her decision without a second thought. "Lock up behind me," she told the empty shop, and went to get her coat. At the station, the three of them gave their statements one after another in a small room down the hall from where Wren was being held, though none of them were told that, and none of them saw her. Frank went first, walking a young officer named Petrov through the whole sequence. The cane knocked to the floor, his knee buckling, Grant's laugh the way it had felt. He said carefully, like the boy hadn't even registered him as a person, just an obstacle in a hallway.
"He's done this before," Frank added, unprompted. "Not to me. To her. To Wren. Every morning for weeks, best I can tell. This town's let it slide because of who his father is. I'd like that written down if it's all the same to you." Petrov wrote it down. Nora went next, one hand resting on her stomach the whole time, voice steady, even though her hands weren't quite. She described the grab, the stumble, the half-second where she genuinely thought she might fall. "I want to be very clear," she said. "Wren Hale did not attack that young man out of nowhere. He put his hands on a pregnant woman on public transportation. I would like somebody to explain to me why that isn't the story making the rounds in this town today." Marjorie's statement was shorter, but no less firm. She hadn't seen the incident on the sidewalk herself, only its aftermath. Earl's face pale in her doorway, Wren untying her apron without a word of hesitation. "I've known that girl a year and a half," Marjorie told the officer. "She's never raised her voice at a single customer. Not once. Not even the difficult ones. If she felt she had to step in today, I'd bet my whole shop that it's because somebody needed stepping in for." By 6:30, three separate accounts, consistent with each other and consistent with the pharmacy's grainy security footage, sat on Chief Doyle's desk, telling a story that had almost nothing in common with the one Walter Colton had walked in demanding he believed 2 hours earlier. The interview room at the Cedar Hollow police station was small, gray-walled, with a single table and 2 chairs and a window that looked out onto the parking lot. Wren sat with her hands folded on the table, back straight, the exact same posture she'd carried onto the bus every morning for a year and a half, if you counted the way old habits keep their own private calendar, regardless of what season a person tells themselves they're in. Waiting. Watching the door. Counting out of habit the number of steps between herself and the exit, though she had no intention of ever needing that information. Chief Doyle came in with a folder and a cup of coffee he didn't offer to share, and sat down across from her. "Ms. Hale," he said, "I appreciate you coming in." "I didn't feel like I had much choice," Wren said, not unkindly, just factually. "You didn't, not really," Doyle admitted. "There's a complaint filed against you. Assault. I need to ask you some questions about what happened outside the pharmacy this afternoon." "All right." "Walk me through it," Wren told him, plainly, without embellishment, without a single word wasted. Grant grabbing Nora's wrist that morning, nearly knocking her down. Frank's cane on the floor of the bus, her decision to confront Grant directly instead of letting it happen a third time, his hand coming toward her shoulder, the hold exactly as long as necessary, exactly as controlled as necessary, released the instant it had made its point. Doyle listened without interrupting, watching her the whole time, with the particular attention of a man cataloging something he hadn't expected to find in this room. Because there was something in the way she described it, not the content, though the content mattered too. It was the shape of it, the precision, the economy of language, no adjectives she didn't need, no drama, no self-justification, just a clean, exact account of force applied and force released.
The way you'd expect from a report written by somebody trained to write reports like that. You said you held him 3 seconds, Doyle said slowly. How do you know it was 3 seconds? Because I counted, Wren said simply. It's a habit. What kind of habit makes a person count seconds while they're restraining someone? Wren looked at him for a long moment. Something passed behind her eyes, not fear, not evasion, something closer to a decision being weighed and set carefully back down, unmade for now. The kind you learn, she said, when it matters exactly how long you hold something and exactly when you let it go. Doyle sat back slightly in his chair. He had spent 6 years, a long time ago, in the Army himself before he came home and traded one uniform for another. He knew that particular economy of language when he heard it. He knew, too, that people who had it rarely offered it up on their own. Ms. Hale, he said more carefully now, is there something in your background I should know about? Something that might explain what I'm seeing on that pharmacy sidewalk footage? Because there was footage, it turned out. A security camera above the pharmacy door had caught the whole exchange, grainy but clear enough, and Doyle had watched it twice already before Wren ever sat down in this room. Watched a young woman disarm a man nearly twice her size with a control and precision that had nothing whatsoever to do with luck. Wren held his gaze steadily. I'd rather not get into it, she said. It's not relevant to what happened today. What's relevant is that a man twice my size grabbed a pregnant woman hard enough to nearly knock her down, knocked an old man's cane out from under him, and then tried to shove me on a public sidewalk. I stopped him. I let him go the second he stopped being a threat. That's the whole of it. Doyle studied her a moment longer, and something in him, some old instinct, sharpened by 6 years of service and 26 more of policing, told him he was looking at only the visible top of something much larger underneath. He didn't push further. Not yet. Procedure required him to hold her for processing, regardless, pending statements from the other witnesses, pending a decision from the district attorney's office on whether Walter Colton's complaint would even go anywhere once those statements came in. I'm going to need to hold you here a while longer, he said. Not because I think you're lying to me, because I've got a councilman's son with a complaint filed, and until I've got enough statements to close this the right way, my hands are somewhat tied. I understand, Wren said, and she did more than he probably realized. She had spent years operating inside chains of command that made far less sense than this one, following procedures she didn't always agree with because the alternative, a world with no procedures at all, was so much worse. For what it's worth, Doyle added, I've been chief here 11 years. I've read a lot of statements from a lot of people trying to make themselves sound braver than they were. Yours didn't sound like that. It sounded like somebody who's had to file a report before, an official one, the kind with a chain of command attached to it. Wren said nothing, but she held his gaze a beat longer than necessary, and something passed between them, unspoken. The recognition of two people who had learned, in different uniforms, the same hard lessons about restraint and consequence. Doyle stood, gathering his folder. At the door, he paused. One more thing, he said. The witness statements coming in this afternoon don't match what Walter Colton told me an hour ago. Not even close. Wren said nothing, but something in her shoulders eased just slightly, the smallest fraction of tension releasing. Sit tight, Doyle said. I don't think you'll be here as long as you're expecting. She was there longer than he'd hoped, as it turned out, because Walter Colton, upon hearing that the pharmacy footage and the witness statements weren't cooperating with his version of events, had made 3 separate phone calls that afternoon, each one designed to slow the process down rather than speed it toward the truth. Wren sat alone in the small gray room for 2 more hours, the light outside the window sliding from afternoon gold into evening blue. She thought about Eleanor, alone in her room at Riverside, wondering where her granddaughter was, why the Tuesday visit hadn't happened. She thought about Nora, home now, presumably one hand on her stomach, the particular fear of a mother who had come too close to something happening to her child because she'd tried to protect a stranger's father figure on a public bus. She thought about Frank, 71 years old, giving a statement to a young officer half his age, describing a cane knocked to the floor with more patience than the moment probably deserved. And she thought, turning the trident charm slowly between two fingers under the table where no one could see, about Danny and about the particular unfairness of a world where the people who did the right thing so often had to spend hours in small gray rooms explaining themselves, while the people who caused the harm got to go home to big comfortable houses and simply forget the whole thing by morning. She didn't let the thought curdle into bitterness. Eleanor's voice again, patient, steady, worn smooth by 4 decades of watching people carry weight that wasn't theirs to carry. "Don't pick it up on my account." She set it down instead, breathed, waited. Somewhere in a filing cabinet across town, locked, undisturbed, a folder with a name on it sat exactly where it had sat for 20 years, waiting for a Tuesday, just like this one, when a chain of small injustices would finally begin, link by link, pulling something much larger up out of the dark where it had been buried. Wren didn't know that yet. She only knew, sitting in a small gray room with her hands folded and her back straight, that she had done the right thing on that sidewalk, and that whatever came next, whatever it cost her, she would not apologize for the 4 seconds she'd held Grant Colton's arm still enough to teach him something his whole life had failed to teach him so far. The door opened again a little after 7. Chief Doyle stood there, expression harder to read than before a single sheet of paper in his hand. "Ms. Hale," he said, "we need to talk about what just came in from the district attorney's office." Wren looked up, steady as ever, and waited to hear what the world had decided to do with her next. Doyle sat back down across from her, set the paper on the table and turned it around so she could read it. "The DA's office reviewed the footage and the statements," he said. "They're not filing assault charges against you, not even close. Between the pharmacy camera and 3 consistent witness accounts, there's no case there. And honestly, Ms. Hale, I don't think there ever was one." Something in Wren's chest loosened, though her face gave almost nothing away. "Thank you," she said simply. "Don't thank me yet." Doyle leaned back, rubbing his jaw. "Walter Colton isn't going to let this go quietly, even without charges to stand on. He's already been on the phone with 2 members of the town council. My understanding is he intends to bring a formal complaint before the council Thursday evening, asking them to consider a public transit restriction against you, and pressuring the bakery to let you go on the grounds of, and I'm quoting him here, public safety concerns regarding erratic and violent behavior." Wren absorbed that in silence for a moment. "He's going to punish me for stopping his son from hurting people." "That's about the size of it," Doyle admitted, not bothering to soften it. "I don't like it. Most of this town isn't going to like it either once the real story gets around, which it will, because half of Cedar Hollow was either on that bus or heard about it from somebody who was. But he's got a council seat and 30 years of favors owed to him, and he's going to spend every one of them trying to make you the villain of this story instead of his son." "When's the hearing?" "Thursday, 7 o'clock, town hall. You're entitled to attend and speak on your own behalf, and I'd strongly recommend you do." Doyle studied her for a long moment. "Ms. Hale, whatever's in your past that let you handle that boy the way you did on that sidewalk, calm, controlled, textbook. If I'm being honest, it might be worth considering whether that's a story you want to tell Thursday night. Sometimes the truth is the fastest way through a lie." Wren's hand drifted briefly to the trident charm at her collar. "Maybe," she said. "I'll think about it." "That's all I'd ask." Doyle stood, gathering the paper. "You're free to go, by the way. I'm sorry it took this long." "You were doing your job," Wren said, and meant it. "I understand procedure better than you'd probably guess." Something flickered in Doyle's expression, a question he didn't quite ask, filed away for later the way Frank had filed away the ghost of a patch on her backpack, the way this whole town, it seemed, was slowly filling a folder on Wren Hale that she hadn't given anyone permission to open. Outside, the evening had gone fully dark, streetlights humming to life along Main Street, and Frank, Nora, and Marjorie were waiting on the sidewalk when Wren finally walked out through the station's front doors. "There she is," Frank said, relief plain on his face, and for a moment nobody said anything at all. The 4 of them just standing there under the streetlight. The particular quiet of people who had been afraid for each other and were only now letting themselves stop. "You didn't have to give statements," Wren said. "Any of you. Didn't have to breathe today either.
Marjorie said, pulling her into a quick, flower-scented hug. Did it anyway. Some things aren't optional, honey.
Nora, still pale but steadier now, reached out and squeezed Wren's hand. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for this morning. I don't think I've said that properly yet."
"You don't need to thank me. I'm going to anyway," Nora said. And something about that, the plain, stubborn kindness of it, made Wren's throat tighten in a way 4 seconds on a pharmacy sidewalk hadn't managed to. Frank fell into step beside her as the group started walking, cane tapping an even rhythm against the sidewalk. "Doyle tell you about Thursday?"
"He did."
"Colton's not going to let this rest," Frank said. "Man like that, he doesn't know how to lose quietly, never has." "I know. You've got a right to fight it," Frank said, glancing sideways at her. "Whatever it is you're not telling this town, Wren. You've got a right to bring it out into the light Thursday night if that's what it takes to keep your job and your bus route and your grandmother's peace of mind 6 days before her surgery." Wren didn't answer right away. She thought of Eleanor's voice worn smooth by 4 decades of watching people carry weight that wasn't theirs to carry. "You don't need to win. You need to hold on to who you are." "I'll think about it," she said again, and this time it sounded a little more like a promise. She didn't go straight home. Instead, with the evening still young and her nerves still too wound up for sleep, she found herself walking toward the town hall annex 2 streets over, a squat brick building that housed, among other things, the county's property records office. Open until 8 on weeknights for exactly the kind of small-town business that never seemed to fit neatly into normal working hours. She wasn't entirely sure walking in what she was looking for, only that a faded sign on a boarded-up building had been sitting in the back of her mind for 2 days now, and Danny's voice kept surfacing at odd hours, uninvited, insistent, the way grief sometimes gets loud right before it hands you something important. The clerk on duty, a tired-looking man in his 60s, glanced up as she approached the counter. "Help you find something? I'm trying to look up old leasing records," Wren said, "for a building on the edge of town, Colton Properties. There's a sign still up, says it was established in 1988. The clerk shrugged and pointed her toward a bank of old filing cabinets in the back room, the digitized records only going back to 2010, everything older than that still living in yellowed folders nobody had touched in years. It took her the better part of an hour working alphabetically through leases and notices and eviction filings that told in their own dry legal language decades of quiet human hardship the town had long since forgotten. Late payments, notices to vacate, small ordinary tragedies filed and stamped and shelved. She almost missed it. A folder near the bottom of a drawer marked 2003. Corners soft with age, edges gone the color of weak tea. Notice to vacate. Tenant Ruiz M. and dependents. Property 214 Hollow Creek Road. Landlord Colton Properties agent for W. Colton. Wren's hands went very still. Not proof of anything, not yet. Ruiz was not an uncommon name. She told herself that immediately, firmly, the way she'd been trained to tell herself not to draw conclusions faster than the evidence allowed. But her eyes moved down the page anyway to the tenant's listed occupation, filled in by hand in blue ink gone pale with time. Widow. 2 dependents, and beneath that, in a different hand, a caseworker's note scrawled almost illegibly in the margin. Family relocating out of state. Older son, age 12, will need new school enrollment. 12 years old in 2003. Danny had been 26 when she lost him 4 years ago. The math sat in her chest like a stone dropped into still water, spreading outward in slow, careful rings. It could be nothing. It could be a coincidence as wide and ordinary as any small town holds 1,000 of. But it could also be the answer to a question she hadn't even known to ask 2 days ago, standing on a bus with a broken cord in her hand, staring at a faded sign she couldn't explain why she couldn't look away from. She closed the folder carefully, the way you close something you're not ready to fully open yet, and carried it to the counter. "Can I get a copy of this?" she asked, and her voice, for the first time in 2 very long days, was not entirely steady. The clerk glanced at the folder,
then at her face, and something in his expression softened, the way small-town people's faces do when they sense, without needing the details, that they're standing near the edge of something that matters.
"Take your time," he said, sliding a copier form across the counter. "We're open till 8.
He turned back to whatever he'd been doing before she walked in, and Wren stood alone at the copier for a long moment, the machine humming and clicking through its work, and thought, not for the first time that week, about how much of a person's history could sit quietly in a drawer for 20 years, waiting for somebody to finally think to look. Outside, the street lights had come fully on, and somewhere across town, behind a big front window still lit up gold, Walter Colton was drafting the notes for a speech he intended to give Thursday night. A speech about public safety and erratic behavior and the responsibility of a community to protect itself. He had no idea, writing that speech at his kitchen island, that a folder with his own company's letterhead on it was, at that very moment, being copied 2 streets away by the last person on earth he wanted digging through his family's past. He had built 30 years of a life on the assumption that paperwork once filed and forgotten stayed that way. Most of the time in a town this size he'd been right. Nobody had ever gone looking. Nobody had ever had a reason to. That reason was standing at a copy machine 2 streets away, holding a folder in hands that had once been trained to hold far heavier things, steady and certain, for the first time in days, that the truth she was chasing was worth whatever it eventually cost her to find. Wren walked home slowly that night, the copied pages folded carefully inside her jacket, the trident charm resting against her collarbone. And for the first time since she'd arrived in Cedar Hollow, she found herself wondering if the quiet life she'd built here had ever really been an accident at all, or if some part of her, without ever quite admitting it, had been waiting the whole time for exactly this kind of Tuesday. She thought of her grandmother, 4 decades of nursing behind her, still awake most nights past what her body probably wanted, still sharp enough to read a lie from across a hospital room. She thought of Frank, filing away small truths the way old soldiers do, patient, unhurried, never once demanding more than a person was ready to give. She thought of Nora, 7 months along, standing up to a man twice her size because it was the right thing to do, and she had never once considered doing anything else. Cedar Hollow had taught her something in the last year and a half that 8 years of service never quite had. That courage didn't always look like a mission. Sometimes it looked like an old man refusing to let go of his cane. Sometimes it looked like a pregnant woman putting her hand up in a moving bus. Sometimes it looked like a whole town, slowly, patiently, deciding to stand behind somebody who had never once asked them to. She reached her apartment above the hardware store a little after 8:30, let herself in, and set the folder carefully on the kitchen table, where it would sit through the rest of that long week like a question she wasn't quite ready to answer yet, but no longer willing to leave unasked. Tomorrow was Wednesday. There would be bread to bake, a hearing to prepare for, and a truth to decide what to do with. She had no way of knowing, turning off the kitchen light and heading to bed, that the truth had already started quietly to move on its own. Wednesday morning came in pale, and still the kind of quiet that sits over a small town right before something in it changes for good. Wren hadn't slept much. The copied pages from the county archive sat on her kitchen table where she'd left them the night before, the old eviction notice for the Ruiz family staring up at her in faded blue ink every time she passed. She'd read it 11 times. It hadn't gotten any less strange to look at by the 11th. She made coffee she didn't finish and sat with it anyway, both hands wrapped around the mug, and thought about Danny at 12 years old, watching his family's things get carried out to a curb somewhere in this state, in some years she hadn't even been born to witness. It could still be a coincidence. She kept telling herself that. Ruiz wasn't a rare name, but some part of her, the part that had spent years learning to trust a feeling in her gut before the evidence caught up to it, already knew it wasn't. She thought about calling Colonel Kane that morning and decided against it twice before she finally decided against it a third time for good. What would she even say? That she'd found an old eviction notice in a drawer in a town Danny had never mentioned by name? That the math worked out roughly if you squinted at it the right way? It wasn't enough yet. She had learned a long time ago not to move on a hunch, no matter how loud it was shouting, until she'd done everything in her power to confirm it first. At the bakery, Marjorie took one look at her face and didn't ask any questions, just put a cinnamon roll in front of her and told her to eat it before it went cold. And Wren, for once, didn't argue. Frank came in a little after 8, and this time he didn't sit at his usual table. He came straight to the counter, glancing once toward the door, like a man checking for company he didn't want overhearing him.
"You hear about the bus?" he asked, voice low.
"What about it?"
"Camera on the 840 route. The one that would have caught everything from yesterday morning, Grant knocking my cane, grabbing Nora's wrist. Transit office says it malfunctioned. Whole recording's gone. Nothing on the hard drive but static."
Wren set down her coffee slowly.
"Malfunctioned.
That's the word they used." Frank's jaw was tight. "Funny thing is, the company that services those cameras does the maintenance contracts for the whole transit fleet. It's a subcontractor out of the county, owned, as it happens, by a holding company that leases its office space from none other than Colton Properties."
Wren went very still. "You're saying somebody erased it on purpose?"
"I'm saying it's a mighty convenient malfunction," Frank said, "happening on the one week that footage would have mattered more than it ever has before."
He leaned in slightly. "But I've got something they don't know about."
He reached into his jacket pocket and set his phone on the counter screen dark.
"I've been recording video on this thing for a few years now," he said. "Habit I picked up after a friend showed me how. Keep it in my coat, propped in the handle of my cane, most days angled up. Half the time I forget it's even running. Yesterday morning when that boy started up on the bus, some old instinct told me to reach down and hit record before he ever touched Nora's wrist." He turned the phone over, thumbed it open, and pressed play. There it was. Shaky, angled, slightly wrong, but unmistakable. Grant's boot against the cane, the laugh, Nora stepping in, the grab, the stumble, every second of it, time-stamped, undeniable, sitting on an old man's phone because some quiet habit had told him without asking why that this was a morning worth keeping. Wren looked up at him, something thick in her throat. "Frank?" "Don't thank me yet," he said, pocketing the phone again like it was something fragile. "Thank me Thursday night, after we've used it for something." Chief Doyle confirmed it himself an hour later, standing in the doorway of the bakery in his uniform, looking more tired than Wren had ever seen him. "The transit camera data's gone," he said. "I pulled the maintenance logs myself this morning. Whoever wiped it did a clean job, professional even, not the kind of mistake a bored technician makes on a slow Tuesday." He glanced at Frank. "I hear you've got something that might make up the difference?" "I do," Frank said. And there was something almost fierce in the old man's voice, a fire Wren hadn't heard from him before. "And I intend to bring it to that hearing Thursday night whether Walter Colton likes it or not." Doyle nodded slowly. "I can't officially endorse citizens showing up to a council hearing with recorded evidence like it's a courtroom, but unofficially, Mr. Delaney, I'd say bring every second of that footage you've got." He turned to Wren before he left. "You given any more thought to what I said about telling your story?" Wren looked down at the folded pages still sitting in her jacket pocket, the ones with a Colton Properties letterhead on them and a name she hadn't stopped thinking about since Tuesday night. "I've been thinking about it," she said. "I think there might be more to tell than either of us realized." Doyle studied her a moment, then reached into his own jacket and pulled out a business card, worn soft at the corners. "This is a number for a colleague of mine over in county records. Retired detective, does some part-time work verifying old documents when things get contested. If that eviction filing turns into something more than a hunch and you want it confirmed properly before you say a word about it in public, give her a call. Better to walk into that hearing with something solid than something you're still guessing at." Wren took the card. "Thank you." "Don't thank me," Doyle said, the smallest flicker of a smile at the corner of his mouth. "I'm just doing my job. Same as you did on that sidewalk, whether this town understood it yet or not." She called the number that afternoon from the back room of the bakery, and by evening had a short, careful confirmation from a woman named Carol Whitfield, who had spent 30 years cross-referencing exactly this kind of paperwork and knew precisely how to separate a real thread from a false one.
The eviction notice was authentic. The property records matched.
There was, Carol said, a reasonable basis to believe the family in question had indeed relocated out of state shortly afterward, though nothing in the county's own records could confirm one way or the other where they'd gone or who that 12-year-old boy had eventually grown up to become. It wasn't proof. Not yet. But it was enough, Wren decided, sitting alone in the bakery's back room with the phone still warm in her hand, to bring into the light instead of leaving buried in a drawer. That evening, she took the bus out to Riverside, the same 640 route she'd ridden 100 times, and found her grandmother sitting up in bed with the television murmuring low, the volume Eleanor always kept just quiet enough that she could pretend she wasn't watching it too closely. "You look like you've got something on your chest," Eleanor said, muting the television without being asked. Wren sat down, and for the first time in a year and a half told her grandmother almost everything. The bus, the pharmacy sidewalk, the 4 seconds she'd held Grant Colton's arm, the police station, the folder in the county archives with a name that might or might not be the beginning of an answer she'd been carrying since a cargo hold somewhere over open water 4 years ago. Eleanor listened without interrupting, the particular stillness of a woman who had spent 41 years learning exactly when a person needed silence more than advice. When Wren finally finished, Eleanor reached over and took her hand. "You know," she said, "I always wondered what would finally bring you back out into the world. I hoped it would be something gentle. A kind man, maybe. A good job you were proud of, not this." She squeezed Wren's fingers. "But I suppose the truth rarely waits for a convenient door to walk through. It just knocks on whichever one happens to be open." "I'm scared, Grandma," Wren admitted, quiet enough that it barely carried past the two of them. "Not of Colton." "Not really. I'm scared of what it means if that name in the file really is Danny's family. I'm scared of standing up in front of this whole town and finally saying who I was, what I did, what I lost. I've spent a year and a half making sure nobody had to look at any of that." "I know, sweetheart." Eleanor's voice was gentle, but it carried the weight of somebody who had watched grief up close for 4 decades and never once flinched from it. "But hiding a thing doesn't make it smaller. It just makes it heavier to carry alone. You've been carrying Danny by yourself in that little apartment for a year and a half. Maybe it's time you let this town help you carry him instead." Wren wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, quick, almost embarrassed by it. "Since when did you get so wise?" "Since about 1963, Eleanor said dryly, and for a moment, just a moment, they both laughed. Soft and real. The kind of laugh that only happens between people who have earned the right to grieve and joke in the very same breath. "Friday," Eleanor said, sobering. "Whatever happens Thursday night, I need you rested and steady for Friday morning. Promise me that." "I promise." "Good." Eleanor settled back against her pillows. "Now go home. Get some sleep. And Wren," she caught her hand once more before she could stand, "whatever you decide to tell that town Thursday night, tell it the way Danny would have wanted you to. Not for pity. Not for revenge. For the truth. He'd have wanted the truth told plain, same as you always do everything else. And remember what I've always told you. You don't need to win a room like that. You only need to hold on to who you are while you're standing in it." Thursday evening, the Cedar Hollow town hall filled up faster than anyone on the council had expected. Word had gotten around the way word always does in a town this size, and by 6:45, every folding chair in the meeting room was full, latecomers lining the walls, Marjorie standing near the back with her arms crossed, Earl beside her, still in his transit uniform, having come straight from his last route of the day. Nora sat in the second row, one hand resting on her stomach, as always, David beside her, holding her other hand. Frank sat near the front cane, across his knees, phone already charged and ready in his coat pocket. Wren sat in the row reserved for those the council had listed as involved parties, hands folded in her lap, back straight, the trident charm resting against her collarbone under her collar, where it always sat. She had worn that evening the same plain blouse she wore most mornings to the bakery,
deliberately, having decided somewhere around midnight that she would not walk into that room dressed as anyone other than exactly who this town had already met. Whatever she told them tonight, she wanted them to understand it had been true the whole time, underneath the flower and the quiet mornings and the 2 words she'd said to a boy on a bus. Give it back. Walter Colton sat across the aisle with a lawyer in an expensive suit, and Grant beside him, arm still faintly bruised, though nothing had actually been damaged, looking for the first time since Monday, genuinely uncertain about how the evening was going to go. The council chair, a soft-spoken woman named Diane Sorensen, called the meeting to order at 7 sharp. 2 other council members flanked her at the front table, an older man named Councilman Whitmore, who kept glancing uneasily at Walter throughout the evening, and a younger woman, newly elected, who had clearly never presided over anything this tense in her short time on the council, and looked more than once like she wished she were anywhere else. "We're here tonight," Diane said, "to hear a formal complaint brought by Councilman Walter Colton regarding an incident on Tuesday involving his son and Ms. Wren Hale, and to consider his request for a public transit restriction and related measures. I'll remind everyone in this room that we conduct these hearings with respect and patience, regardless of how strong feelings may run tonight. Councilman Colton, the floor is yours." Walter's lawyer stood, instead, smooth and practiced, and began painting a picture that Wren had half expected, but still found strange to hear out loud, like listening to a story about a stranger who happened to share her name. A woman with an unexplained history of violent behavior, an unprovoked attack on a young man on a public sidewalk, a pattern of concerning conduct that raised serious questions about her fitness to use public transportation, let alone remain employed in a business that served elderly and vulnerable customers. He asked the council to approve a transit restriction and a formal recommendation that Miller's Bakery reconsider Ms. Hale's employment, citing public safety. Marjorie's arms tightened across her chest so hard her knuckles went white. The council members exchanged glances. A few nodded slightly as the lawyer spoke, the particular reflexive nod of people used to trusting whoever spoke first and loudest in a room like this. For a moment it looked like it might actually work. It looked, sitting there in that folding chair with her hands folded in her lap, like the truth was going to lose to a well-tailored suit and 30 years of favors owed to a man with a council seat. Then Diane Sorensen turned to Wren. "Ms. Hale, would you like to respond?" Wren stood. The room went quiet in the particular way rooms go quiet when the person everyone has been talking about finally opens her mouth to talk back. "Thank you," she said, and her voice, though soft, carried to every corner of the room the way it always did when she meant every word of what she was saying. "I want to start by telling you what actually happened on Tuesday morning, because it isn't what you just heard." She told them. Plainly, the way she'd told Chief Doyle 2 nights before. No embellishment, no drama. Frank's cane knocked to the floor. Nora's wrist grabbed hard enough to make a pregnant woman stumble. Her decision to confront Grant directly, rather than let it happen a 3rd time, 4 seconds of controlled restraint released the instant the threat had passed. "I want to be honest with this room about something else too," she said, and here her voice wavered just slightly before steadying again. "For a year and a half, I've let this town believe I was somebody quiet because that's simply who I am. That's not the whole truth, and I think given everything, this town deserves the whole truth tonight." She reached up and, for the first time since she'd arrived in Cedar Hollow, pulled the paracord cord out from under her collar, the small, dented trident charm swinging free for the whole room to see. "Before I moved here, I served 8 years in the United States Navy," she said. "The last several of those years I served as part of a special operations team. I was trained to do things most people in this room have never had to think about. I was trained, among other things, in exactly how much force is necessary to stop a threat and exactly when to stop applying it. That's what happened on that sidewalk Tuesday. Not an attack. A trained, controlled response to a man twice my size who put his hands on me after already putting his hands on a pregnant woman and knocking an elderly man's cane out from under him. A murmur went through the room, the particular sound of a town rearranging all at once everything it thought it understood about one of its own quiet neighbors. Walter's lawyer opened his mouth to object, but Diane Sorensen held up a hand, and something in her expression told him this was not the moment to interrupt. I lost someone I served with, Wren continued, quieter now, and the room leaned in to hear her. 4 years ago, on a mission I'm still not permitted to discuss in detail. His name was Danny Ruiz. Everyone who knew him called him Doc. He was the best man I've ever served beside, and I've thought about him every single day since I lost him. Her hand tightened around the charm. He gave me this, she said, the week before he died. Told me it was for luck, though he never needed luck himself. He made his own. On Monday morning, Grant Colton tore it off my neck and put his boot on it, and I stood there and let him. Because a long time ago, my grandmother taught me that you don't need to win a fight to hold on to who you are. She let that sit a moment. But this week, I found something in the county property archives that I think this council and this family, she glanced briefly, deliberately at Walter, deserves to hear. She read the notice aloud, the address, the date, the name. Ruiz M. and dependents, landlord, Colton Properties agent for W. Colton. A widow and 2 dependents evicted in 2003. A caseworker's note about a 12-year-old boy needing new school enrollment out of state. I don't know for certain yet that this is Danny's family, Wren said. I want to be honest about that too. Ruiz isn't an uncommon name, and I won't stand here and claim a certainty I don't have, but I think it deserves to be looked into properly, publicly, instead of buried in a filing cabinet the way it's apparently been buried for over 20 years. Walter Colton's face had gone pale, paler than the room's fluorescent lighting could account for on its own. This is absurd, he managed, standing halfway out of his seat. Ancient history has nothing to do with tonight's complaint. Doesn't it? Said a voice from the back of the room. Every head turned. The doors at the rear of the town hall had opened without anyone quite noticing, and standing in the frame, in a dress uniform that hadn't seen use in some time but still fit like it had been tailored yesterday, was a woman in her late 50s, silver-haired, ramrod straight, with the particular bearing of someone who had spent a career commanding rooms far more dangerous than this one. My apologies for the entrance, she said, walking down the center aisle with unhurried authority. My name is Colonel Patricia Kane, United States Navy retired. I drove 4 hours to be here tonight after a phone call from a young woman I trained 8 years ago told me there might finally be a room willing to listen to the truth about her. Wren's breath caught. She hadn't called Colonel Kane. She hadn't spoken to her in over a year. Frank had, quietly, 2 nights ago after Wren had told him, in a rare unguarded moment at the bakery counter, the name of the officer who had once commanded her unit. He'd found a number through an old Veterans Network contact and made the call himself, without telling her, betting that the truth, once summoned properly, would know exactly where it needed to stand. Colonel Kane reached the front of the room and turned to face the council and then deliberately the gathered town of Cedar Hollow. I'm not here to discuss classified operations, she said, and I won't. But I can tell you this much on the record in this room. Petty Officer Wren Hale served under my command for 6 years. She is, without exaggeration, one of the finest operators I had the privilege of leading in a 30-year career. 4 years ago, during a hostage rescue operation I still cannot discuss in detail, she made a decision under fire that saved the lives of every member of her team at considerable personal risk to herself. She did not save mine that day, only because I was not on that mission. But she saved the life of a young corpsman named Petty Officer Ruiz, twice before the situation turned in a direction none of us could control. A silence fell over the room, so complete that the hum of the fluorescent lights seemed suddenly loud. Danny Ruiz died a hero, Colonel Kane continued, her voice steady but not unkind. He died doing exactly what he'd trained to do, protecting people who could not protect themselves. Ms. Hale has carried that loss for 4 years with a dignity I've rarely seen matched. I would trust her with my life without a second's hesitation, and I have on more than one occasion done exactly that. She turned then, deliberately, toward Walter Colton, whose lawyer had gone very quiet beside him. There's something else I think this room should know, Colonel Kane said. When I heard the name Colton mentioned in connection with tonight's hearing, I made a call of my own before I got in my car.
To a colleague who still works in recruitment records. Your son, Mr. Colton, applied to enlist 11 years ago. He was rejected, not for medical reasons, but because a physical fitness assessment submitted on his behalf was found to be falsified. Someone claiming to administer his entrance testing had signed off on numbers that didn't match the young man who actually showed up to the follow-up evaluation. The recruiting office flagged it quietly and declined to pursue the matter further, choosing simply to close the file rather than pursue formal charges. I imagine that's not a story that's been told very often at Colton family dinners. Grant, beside his father, had gone the color of old paper. "That's a lie," he said, but his voice cracked in the middle of it, and nobody in that room believed him, least of all, it seemed, his own father, who was staring at his son with an expression Wren had never seen on him before, something between disbelief and a very old, very buried shame finally surfacing. Colonel Kane turned back to the room at large, her voice softening now, the hard authority of her opening remarks giving way to something more personal. "I want to say one more thing, and then I'll sit down," she said. "I've spent 30 years around young men and women who mistake volume for strength the same way this young man apparently has. Most of them grow out of it given the right kind of correction at the right point in their lives. I have no illusions that a town hall meeting alone will fix whatever's gone wrong here. But I can tell you what real strength looks like because I spent 6 years watching it firsthand. It looks like a 24-year-old woman choosing morning after morning not to hurt somebody who deserved it because hurting him wouldn't have protected anybody. It looks like restraint nobody in this room had any right to expect from her given everything she's already given this country. And it looks like standing up finally in a room full of strangers and telling the truth about a grief she's carried alone for 4 years because she decided this town was worth trusting with it. She looked directly at Wren. "I am prouder of you tonight, Petty Officer Hale, than I have been in longer than you know." Wren's composure, so carefully held through the entire evening, finally cracked just slightly at that, and she pressed the back of her hand briefly to her mouth, steadying herself, while half the room around her did the same. Frank stood then, cane in one hand, phone in the other. "I've got footage from Tuesday morning," he said to Diane Sorensen, to the whole silent room. "The bus camera that would have shown this conveniently malfunctioned the same week the maintenance contract happens to run through a company leasing its office from Colton Properties. But I keep my own record. Been doing it a few years now. I'd like this council to see it." Diane Sorensen nodded, and the room watched in near total silence, the shaky angled, unmistakable footage of a 71-year-old man's cane knocked to the floor, a pregnant woman's wrist grabbed hard enough to make her stumble, and a young woman named Wren Hale stepping in only after every other option had already failed. When it ended, nobody in that room had a single question left about what had actually happened on that bus, or on that sidewalk, or in the 4 seconds it had taken to end it. Councilman Whitmore cleared his throat into the silence. "I think I speak for this council when I say we've heard more than enough tonight to understand exactly what took place and exactly who this complaint should never have been filed against in the first place." The younger council member beside him nodded, visibly relieved to finally have somewhere solid to stand. Walter Colton sat very still, his lawyer beside him no longer bothering to whisper anything at all. The man had in fact quietly gathered his briefcase several minutes earlier, sensing the way lawyers in expensive suits often do exactly which way a room was about to turn. "Mr. Colton," Diane Sorensen said, quiet but firm, "do you have anything you'd like to add?" For a long moment, Walter said nothing. He looked at his son, at the pale, trembling shape of a 30-year-old man who had never once in his entire life been made to answer for anything. And something in Walter's face finally visibly broke. He stood slowly. "I think," he said, and his voice, so practiced, so smooth all evening, came out rough now, unrehearsed. "I think I owe this council an apology, and I think I owe somebody else in this town a much older one, if what Ms. Hale found in that archive turns out to be what I'm very much afraid it is." He looked then directly at Wren. "I don't remember the Ruiz family," he admitted. "That's the truth, and it's a shameful one.
I evicted a great many families over the years. Ms. Hale and I never once thought hard enough about a single one of them to remember a name. I built a business and eventually a career in this council on being efficient about things like that. I am beginning to understand, sitting in this room tonight, exactly what that kind of efficiency costs other people. His voice caught. If that widow's 12-year-old son grew up to be the man who saved your life and lost his own doing it, then I am the last person in this room who has any right to stand up here tonight and ask you to be punished for anything. He turned to the council. I withdraw my complaint, he said. And I think, given everything this room has just heard, it's clear I've got no business continuing to hold a council seat in a town I've apparently done this kind of harm in quietly for years without ever once being made to see it. I'll be submitting my resignation in the morning. He sat back down, hands trembling slightly, and beside him Grant Colton stared at the floor. The first real silence Wren had ever seen settle over him. The silence of a man finally, belatedly, meeting the bottom of himself, and finding, underneath all that noise, almost nothing there at all. Diane Sorensen let the room breathe for a moment before speaking again. I think, she said carefully, this council owes Ms. Hale a formal apology of its own for entertaining this complaint as long as we did. Ms. Hale, on behalf of this council, and I believe on behalf of this town, I'm sorry. A sound rose from the back of the room then, quiet at first, and Wren turned to see Marjorie clapping, and then Earl beside her, and then Nora, one hand still on her stomach, and then Frank, cane propped against his chair so he could bring both hands together properly, and then the whole room, standing. The particular sound of a small town finally fully standing up for one of its own. Wren stood very still in the middle of it, the trident charm warm against her palm where she'd closed her fist around it without noticing, and let herself, for the first time in 4 years, feel the weight of Danny's memory, not as a wound she carried alone, but as something a whole room full of strangers had just agreed to help her carry. Chief Doyle, standing near the side door, straightened, and as Wren's eyes found his across the room, he brought his hand up in a slow, deliberate salute, the kind two people who'd once worn different uniforms understand without needing a single word to explain it. Grant Colton left the building before the applause had even fully died down, alone, his father staying behind to speak quietly with Diane Sorensen and eventually with Wren herself, an apology that took a long time to get through, and still felt by the end of it like it hadn't found enough words. Outside in the parking lot, the town emptied out slowly in small clusters, people lingering the way they do after something has shifted, and nobody quite wants to be the first to drive home and let the ordinary evening swallow it back up. Wren stood near the front steps for a while, accepting a dozen small, awkward, well-meant things from people she barely knew. A hand on her shoulder from a man who ran the hardware store below her apartment. A quiet thank you from a woman who'd sat 3 rows back and never said a word during the whole hearing. Louise Parker found her near the bottom of the steps, tea long since gone cold in a paper cup she was still somehow holding. I told you somebody ought to teach that boy different, Louise said. Didn't expect it to be quite this thorough a lesson. Wasn't really my intention, Wren said. The lesson, I mean. I just wanted him to stop. Sometimes stopping somebody is the lesson, Louise said, and patted her arm once before disappearing into the thinning crowd. The particular satisfaction of a retired teacher who had waited a very long time to see a difficult student finally meet a consequence. The days between Thursday night and Friday morning moved strangely, the way days do after something enormous has finally cracked open. News of the hearing spread through Cedar Hollow by breakfast, the way news always did, and by the time Wren opened the bakery Friday, the town seemed to look at her differently. Not with pity, and not quite with awe either, but with something steadier. Recognition. The particular warmth a small town offers someone it has finally, fully seen. Grant Colton did not show up at his job at the family company that week, or the week after. Word came eventually filtered through the particular grapevine that runs through towns like Cedar Hollow that Walter had asked him to leave the business entirely, and that Grant had moved to stay with an aunt 2 states away. a young man forced for the first time in his life to build something without his father's name doing the building for him. Chase and Dylan, for their part, showed up separately at the bakery the following week, awkward and unannounced, and offered Wren an apology that was clumsy but sincere. The kind young men give when they are only just beginning to understand the difference between going along with something and standing against it. She accepted both apologies, plainly, without making either of them perform more remorse than they'd already offered, because that too felt like a way of holding on to who she was. Walter Colton submitted his resignation from the council the following Monday as promised, along with a public statement acknowledging the Ruiz eviction and pledging to establish a fund in Danny Ruiz's name to help families facing eviction find stable housing before they lost everything the way the Ruiz family once had. It wasn't enough to undo 20 years. Nobody, least of all Wren, expected it to be, but it was more than silence. And in a town like Cedar Hollow, that counted for something real. He came to the bakery himself a week later, alone, without a lawyer or a prepared statement this time, and asked, simply, quietly, if he could speak with her for a few minutes when she had time. They sat at Frank's usual table by the window, and Walter, hands folded in front of him like a man 20 years older than he'd looked the week before, told her what little he'd managed to piece together since the hearing. A widow named Maria Ruiz, records showed, had indeed relocated out of state in the fall of 2003, 2 children in tow, and had, according to a public obituary, Walter's assistant had eventually located, passed away herself 9 years later, having never remarried, having worked 2 jobs for most of the years in between. "I can't give you certainty," Walter told her, voice unsteady. "I don't know for certain that boy grew up to be the man who saved your life. I don't know if I ever will. But I wanted you to have what I found, whatever it turns out to mean." Wren thanked him, and meant it, and understood sitting across from a man who had spent 30 years mistaking efficiency for decency that some truths in this world arrive not as certainty, but as a door left honestly open for whoever needs to walk through it later, when they're ready. "For what it's worth," Walter said, standing to leave, "I don't expect forgiveness, Ms. Hale. I'm not sure I've earned the right to ask for it. But I intend to keep looking for as long as it takes, until I have something more solid to give you than a hunch and an old obituary." "I believe you," Wren said, and found a little to her own surprise that she did. It wasn't absolution. She wasn't sure she was the one with the authority to grant that, even if she'd wanted to. But it was at least a beginning, and after everything this week had cost both of them, a beginning felt like more than she'd expected to walk away with. Friday morning, Wren was at Riverside Care Home before sunrise, sitting beside her grandmother's bed as the surgical team prepped the operating room down the hall. "You look steadier than I've seen you in a year," Eleanor said, squeezing her hand as the orderlies came to wheel her down. "I feel steadier," Wren admitted. "I think I finally put something down I've been carrying a long time." "Good," Eleanor said. "That's exactly what I hoped Thursday would give you, whatever else came of it." She smiled, a little tired, a little scared beneath the calm, the way anyone facing a Friday like this one has every right to be. "I'll see you on the other side of this, sweetheart." "You will," Wren said, and meant it with her whole chest, and held her grandmother's hand until the very last second the hallway would allow. The surgery took 3 hours. Wren spent every minute of it in the waiting room, the trident charm turning slowly between her fingers. Marjorie and Frank arriving an hour in with coffee, neither of them needed, but both of them brought anyway because that was simply what this town did now, showed up for each other the way it perhaps should have all along. Dr. Palmer came out at last, tired but smiling, and told her it had gone exactly as well as anyone could have hoped. It had, he added, gone about as smoothly as a surgery of that kind ever does, and Eleanor's heart, tired as it was, had held up exactly the way 41 years of taking care of other people's hearts had apparently taught it to. Wren put her face in her hands for just a moment, the whole week finally fully catching up to her all at once, before she straightened, wiped her eyes, and went to sit beside her grandmother's bed until Eleanor opened her own eyes again, groggy, blinking, and immediately, unmistakably herself. "Well?" Eleanor murmured, voice thick with anesthesia. "Did I miss anything?" Wren laughed, wet and real.
Nothing you need to worry about right now.
That evening, riding the 6:40 bus back into town, Earl at the wheel, as always, Wren took her usual seat near the back left side, facing the aisle. The same seat she'd chosen on her very first ride through Cedar Hollow, back when nobody in this town had a single reason to know her name.
Old habit. But something about the bus felt different tonight.
Frank sat 2 rows up, chatting easily with Nora, who was leaning back with the particular relief of a woman past the worst of her worry, now baby kicking steadily, husband beside her. A few other regulars nodded to Wren as she passed, small, ordinary nods that meant, in the quiet language of small towns, "We see you now, and we're glad of it."
Earl caught her eye in the long mirror above his head. "Evening, Wren."
"Evening, Earl."
"Good day." She thought about the surgery, about her grandmother sleeping soundly now back at Riverside, heart steady, future long. About a folder in a county archive that had cracked open a truth 20 years buried. About a room full of strangers standing up all at once for a woman who had spent a year and a half trying to convince them there was nothing worth standing up for.
"Good day," she agreed. She reached up out of habit and touched the trident charm resting against her collarbone, scratched, dented at one edge, still unmistakably itself, still carrying somewhere in its small, worn shape everything Danny Ruiz had given his life protecting. Not for glory, not even in the end for country, in the abstract way people always meant that word, for this. For an old man's cane, and a mother's steady hand on her stomach, and a bus driver's nod in a long rearview mirror, and a town small enough to finally fully learn how to see the people quietly holding it together. The bus rolled on through the last light of evening, past the hardware store, past the elementary school, past a boarded-up building where a faded sign no longer felt like a splinter she couldn't name, but like a wound, finally, honestly, beginning to heal. In the weeks that followed, a letter arrived for Wren from a records office 2 states away, forwarded through Colonel Kane. It confirmed what Walter's own search had only gestured toward. Maria Ruiz's widow had relocated with 2 children in the fall of 2003, and her older son had, years later, enlisted in the Navy under his mother's maiden name. A small detail that had kept the 2 threads of this story apart for so long until a folding chair in a town hall finally pulled them together. Wren read it twice at her kitchen table, then carried it out to Riverside the next morning and read it a 3rd time aloud to her grandmother, who held her hand through every word and did not once let go. She thought about all the ordinary Mondays that had led to that one particular Friday. About a bakery and a bus route and a town that had spent a year and a half seeing exactly what it expected to see in a quiet young woman in the back row until it finally learned to look closer. Cedar Hollow hadn't fixed everything. It never would, but it had asked honestly for the truth, and it had shown up honestly once it heard it. And for a woman who had spent 4 years carrying a friend's memory alone, that turned out to be enough to build something new on. She never stopped watching the doors on that bus, or counting the exits, or sitting with her back to the wall. Some habits she'd come to understand weren't wounds to be cured. They were simply how a person stayed ready in case a town like this one, or any town, ever needed somebody willing to hold the line again. And most evenings now, Frank's laugh carried easily down the aisle behind her, and Nora's baby kicked steady beneath a mother's patient hand, and the lights of Cedar Hollow came on one by one for people who had finally learned to look after each other the way somebody had quietly been looking after them all along.